Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone. This is Dylan, sitting in the host chair for a little solo trip down memory lane. Today, we're going to do something a little different. Instead of going historical in the sense of, big, grand, sweeping points of history, we're going to do something a little more on the pop culture side. It's been a while since we've done one of these little fun episodes. So today, we're going to time travel back to a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Specifically, Los Angeles in 1977. May 25th is the premiere of arguably one of the most influential movies in all of history, especially in modern history and in fiction and science fiction and fantasy, the original Star Wars by George Lucas. So imagine it's May 25th, 1977, Star Wars, not yet titled Episode 4, A New Hope, is premiered, and it doesn't become the massive success we know from our own timeline. The idea that we're going to explore today is, what if Star Wars had been slightly less successful at the box office, thus causing George Lucas to, instead of have The Empire Strikes Back as the sequel to Star Wars, he uses Alan Dean Foster's original sequel treatment written during the production of the original Star Wars, before they knew how successful it would be, called Splinter of the Mind's Eye. So our fork today, we're going to explore, what if this was the actual sequel to Star Wars, instead of Empire and Return of the Jedi and spawning this whole massive Skywalker saga of 6.5 good movies and then 2.5 not so great things that we try not to talk about. So here's kind of the setup. When Lucas was filming the original Star Wars, he had an idea for filming something in the Flash Gordon universe. He had loved growing up watching those Flash Gordon serials as a kid, and he really wanted to do something in that universe. But he could never get the rights, as he's starting in the early 60s and the late 60s and early 70s, starting to become a director and a writer. And he could never get the rights to Flash Gordon, so he decided he was going to create his own sort of space adventure serial universe. And that is what ended up becoming first the Adventure of the Wills and all of the various titles that we know, the Adventures of Anakin Starkiller and all of that kind of fun stuff, but congealed into the Star Wars film that we know from 1977. Let's imagine that, like I said, it's still successful at the box office, but for whatever reason, be it that audiences just don't like his particular brand of space weirdness that year. It's not nearly the box office sort of juggernaut that it is today. In reality, this is the biggest summer blockbuster from Jaws, the original summer blockbuster in 1975, until E.T. in 1982. For 5 years after this, no movie could beat this in terms of summer box office performance. So, because of this lesser success, Lucas is pressured by the studio, because he doesn't have the free reign that he got and to basically do sort of whatever he wanted, because he was the man who had made all this money with his crazy crackpot science fantasy idea. Instead of, having free reign, he's pressured by the studio to, he doesn't have free reign. He's got to use at least some of what he already has. So he turns to this treatment that he had Alan Dean Foster write, with the idea that if it wasn't a super successful movie, he would be able to use, a lot of the same sets. They'd be able to shave on, sort of production stuff. They wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel, basically, and they could use a lot of the stuff from the original film. We'll say that, Irvin Kershner is still hired to direct, because Lucas already knew him at the time, but he doesn't hire Lawrence Kasdan to rewrite the script that ends up becoming The Empire Strikes Back. And, Lawrence Kasdan ended up having this huge career, and probably still does in the 1980s, but he doesn't hire Kasdan to create this new script. Instead, he's going to use Foster's treatment and kind of go off of that, and it becomes this version of a Star Wars sequel. Now, for those of you who have not read or don't know about Splinter of the Mind's Eye, I'm going to give you a real quick Cliff Notes version, just so that you all kind of, have something to go off of and understand sort of what exactly I'm talking about. So in Splinter of the Mind's Eye, Luke has shot the ion bomb into the Death Star exhaust port. It blows up. He's beaten the bad guys. They ride off into the sunset. Splinter reads much more like the sort of earlier, almost Flash Gordon-esque serials. It's almost like a Wild West adventure kind of serial. It's your flavor of the week. They're going on this adventure. Things happen. There's not as much of the continuity of the original story as we would expect from what we got in our timeline, where it's this grand sweeping saga. To keep a long story short, Luke and Leia are traveling on a planet. They're trying to recruit it to the Rebel Alliance. They've got R2-D2 and C-3PO, the Golden God, with them. When they're flying to this planet, an energy storm in the system causes them to crash on the neighboring planet, which is called Mimban. When they crash, they run across an Imperial energy mine, which is the source of this crash that caused them to hit the planet. They hide in a local bar to try and get info. They try to find passage through the spaceport. Again, these are kind of beats that you see, echo the original movie. They run across a woman who can feel Luke's force strength. She's some kind of force-sensitive person herself. She shows him a fragment of what's called a Kyber crystal. This is the first appearance, Star Wars nerds among you, of this Kyber crystal, which is now in sort of the current Star Wars universe, is a much more sort of well-known thing. But at the time, this was just this sort of magical crystal that nobody really understood that could focus the Force. She, this Force-sensitive lady they meet at the bar, offers to help Luke and Leia get off-world if they help her find the rest of this Kyber crystal. As they're finishing up in the bar, they get in a bar fight on the way out, and basically because of this fracas at the bar, the stormtroopers come in, because this is an Imperial town, and they confiscate the little Kyber crystal chunk, Luke's lightsaber, and then they imprison Luke and Leia. While they're in the prison, of course, it is a good Star Wars story. You've got to meet some fuzzy alien friends. They meet some, fuzzy alien prisoners who are also stuck in jail. They break out, and then they try to find the magic temple in these misty swamps on Mimban, where this Kyber crystal is supposedly held. As they get into the swamps, they get caught by a monster, and they try to fight it, and long story short, they fall down a well, and then they have to find an escape route underground. Again, dark, misty, swampy interiors. They don't have to use a whole lot of these grand sweeping sets. They don't have to film on location in some, frozen, barren waste like they do in Episode 5. They can just reuse a lot of studio sets, a lot of swampy, misty stuff, which echoes in, the Episode 5 that we got in sort of the Dagobah sequences with Yoda. It's dark, a lot of trees and swamp and fog everywhere that doesn't have to be super well lit, doesn't have to show a lot. Anyway, they're in the underground, they're trying to find their way out, and they run across this local tribe, which gives major Ewoks vibes from Episode 6. You can see how Lucas was reusing some of these ideas, or versions of them, in the sequels that he did giving in our timeline. So they find this sort of underground lake tribe. There's this giant, massive underground lake, and they use the help of the local tribe. After Luke has to get into a fight with the tribe's champion to become friends. They sort of are hanging out, having all their happy fun times after their sort of beach volleyball duel on the shores of the underground lake. Luke senses Darth Vader coming because he's got the Force. He knows Darth Vader knows him, and something's coming. And so the Imperial stormtroopers are on their way. They end up fighting the stormtroopers with the help of this lake tribe. They then steal a transport, Luke and Leia, his fuzzy friends, the Force Lady, and they head towards the temple, finally. Luke ends up fighting this monster that's like taking over the temple. Think of like a minotaur or something else from Greek mythology, kind of this monstrous guardian of the temple. He ends up fighting it. He cuts down one of the temple columns to try and crush this monster, but when he does it, he ends up getting his own leg pinned. So he's stuck. The monster's not done yet. Leia has to pick up Luke's lightsaber, again, kind of these echoes of ideas about Leia becoming a Jedi eventually that we would have to deal with in the Star Wars universe, and especially the expanded universe of novels. She fights the monster for a little bit and starts fighting Darth Vader when he shows up. The alien buddies unpin Luke. He grabs the saber. He takes over fighting Vader from Princess Leia. Luke ends up cutting Darth Vader's arm off. Again, Lucas loves amputating people in these movies. I don't know why. It's just a thing he does. Everybody gets an arm chopped off. Poor Darth Vader's, I think, now getting 5 limbs cut off. If you count his sort of, canon backstory and all of this. Vader loses his arm, falls into a pit, just like Darth Maul from episode 1. But he doesn't die. Somehow Luke senses him. He knows that Vader's not finished yet. Again, they have to tease that the bad guy's around because this is more of a serial style story. Vader's got to be able to come back for whatever other adventures they're going to have. Vader's down the pit. He's defeated but not out. Luke and Leia, they take the Force lady and they speed off after getting the Kyber crystal, run into the mists of Mimban like this sort of Wild West riding off into the sunset, and cut to credits. That is basically a 3-minute version of what happens in Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the Alan Dean Foster treatment that George Lucas had. Like I said, they were trying to do this to keep production costs down. This was originally envisioned as a sort of Flash Gordon serial-esque stuff. So let's explore what exactly this might look like in terms of, what that would do to the wider timeline. I think, first things first, we should talk about what actually happens to Star Wars itself. Like I've said, I don't think Star Wars becomes the sort of grand Skywalker saga dynasty thing that we know from our timeline, although this does save us from some prequel and sequel movies that I will not bash for the purposes of this podcast, but it's pretty clear where some of my feelings are at this point. Instead, it kind of becomes more, of a film serial format, almost in the vibe of the Indiana Jones movies. If you look at those movies, there's really not a lot other than the Indiana Jones character that ties them together. In The Last Crusade, there's some family backstory revealed of, Sean Connery's as his dad and sort of his start as a Boy Scout and how he gets the hat and they have the fight on the train. But the Indiana Jones movies, conceptually, they're just these like globe-trotting adventurer serials from the 1930s. So that, I think, is much more of what Star Wars looks like. You're probably going to end up seeing it sort of look like some of the Star Trek movies that also happened in the late 70s and 80s. You have success in the beginning, and kind of as they go on, you see ever sort of diminishing returns. They're not unsuccessful movies by any means, but they're slowly, kind of making less money every time, and they're sort of dragging out. I think it would probably peter out. You assume it gets 3 or 4 movies like an Indiana Jones series or something like that. It would probably peter out in the late 80s or early 90s, which, kind of tracks in some sort of, overall culture and pop culture, sort of zeitgeist changes in our own timeline as we move from the Reagan era into the sort of 90s of Bill Clinton and the fall of the Soviet Union and all that stuff. The only way I think that gets stretched out is if one of the sequels, has something and becomes kind of a huge hit in its own right and sort of, defibrillate some extra heartbeats back into the franchise. But I don't think it's going to become this sort of massive thing that we saw in our timeline. Obviously, without Empire Strikes Back, there is no magic Darth Vader reveal that he is, in fact, spoiler alerts for a movie that's now going on almost 40 years old, actually more than 40 years old, that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father. That whole family dynasty thing isn't there. Obviously, that's one of the most iconic sort of twists in pop movie history. So that doesn't happen. There's not going to be this sort of vast science fiction world building, especially as a concept that you see. That actually kind of came about from the expanded universe of novels that actually got started with this sequel treatment and a couple of the other ones, because they were released as sort of unofficial content when the movies were coming out in our timeline. And that then inspired people to go on and write, just to throw out some of my favorites out there, the Bounty Hunter trilogy of what happens with Boba Fett after he gets eaten by the Sarlacc, or, the Yuuzhan Vong and some of what happens with Luke and Han and Leia's kids in the sort of Jedi and Sith battles that they fight to save the galaxy. None of that is around, at least in the sort of format that we understand it from our universe. This is probably the biggest, earliest sort of monolithic film franchise in pop culture. So we probably also, at least in some way, shape, or form, don't get today the modern sort of superhero universe films and sort of IP universes. Marvel obviously is the most successful one. Star Wars is still around. They still have all kinds of TV shows and movies coming out. DC Comics, tried it famously and wasn't able to do it. Paramount, I think, is the studio that tried to do the whole monster movie universe thing. They were going to try and revive their Swamp Thing and Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde and all that. But the Tom Cruise movie that they were going to use, the reboot of The Mummy, just completely flopped. So this whole idea of this sort of connected universe of movies and media, I think, probably does end up coming around at some point, but it's not. Star Wars is not the juggernaut that kicks it off. It's not a proven thing that can happen by, the mid-late 80s. Instead, it's still kind of a hypothetical pipe dream. There's probably some film executives who are hoping that it can happen, but there's not really a franchise or an IP that can really support it that they can see super evidently. In terms of the actual people involved, George Lucas, I think, probably does not become a household name after creating this whole mega franchise. He's probably still well known in Hollywood. American Graffiti had been pretty well received in terms of sort of the sort of Hollywood scene, even if it wasn't a huge hit across the country. He was friends with Francis Ford Coppola. Why am I forgetting his name? The guy who did E.T. God bless. This is embarrassing to be doing this live on Steven Spielberg. There we go. He was friends with Steven Spielberg and Francis Ford Coppola, that kind of, director pack that came up, the sort of new Hollywood guys that came up in the late 60s and early 70s. So I'm sure he would be doing movies other than these. He'd be helping out with their stuff, but he's not this sort of like household name because he invented Star Wars. The real interesting thing is, what would he do? He probably would still write some stuff with Indiana Jones because that was kind of a him and Spielberg thing. He, helps with some other stuff. I'm sure he would at least help, if he really needed it, he would help direct or produce some of Stevens and Francis's movies and stuff, but he's not this sort of, monolithic figure in science fiction movies that we think of him as today. Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker, honestly probably has the most relatively comparable career. Mark Hamill didn't really do a whole lot other than Star Wars in terms of big Hollywood movies. The most famous thing he's famous for other than Star Wars is really his voice animation work. Those of you who grew up in the late 80s and early 90s like I did, you will probably remember his most famous stint as being the Joker in Batman the Animated Series and a bunch of other DC cartoon stuff like that. He does an incredible performance as the Joker, does a lot of other voice capture work. So I think that is still where Hamill ends up going. He may, probably has a different trajectory to get into it. He may have some different roles, but I think that probably still ends up being sort of where he goes. Although who knows, he may have a slightly longer Hollywood film trajectory because he's not just indelibly associated with this mega pop culture hit. He may actually have a few more roles, but just from having seen a lot of his work, I think he still leans towards a lot of that, voice acting work that he does in our timeline. Carrie Fisher, probably the same thing. She was the scion of a family of, Hollywood royalty, basically. Both of her parents, I think, were Hollywood, movie stars and bigwigs. She ended up actually, having quite a few roles throughout the 80s and 90s. Blues Brothers is always a favorite of mine because she's the jilted boy girlfriend of Jake Belushi, the Joliet Jake, the Blues Brother. She finds him in the sewer and he begs her to not kill him and blah, blah, blah. And he swears he's changed. That's always a fan favorite of mine. But she actually had a really good career as sort of a script doctor. When other movies, she was a very good writer. When a lot of movies, especially in the 80s and 90s, had trouble, the producers didn't like the scripts that they were getting from the writers, Carrie Fisher would get brought in a lot of times to sort of nudge the script to tighten it up and sort of make it what the producers wanted. So she was actually a very good script doctor behind the scenes in Hollywood. And I see her probably doing the same thing. Harrison Ford is the big one that I think is probably going to have the most different career. He famously, those of you who know sort of about Star Wars lore around the making of it, by the time Star Wars is getting produced, he's quit acting. He had a shot in American Graffiti that Lucas had produced, so that's how they knew each other. He had some minor roles in Francis Ford Coppola stuff. He actually has an uncredited role in Apocalypse Now that even I didn't know about. But by 1977, he's quit acting. He has a wife and a kid, so he becomes a self-taught carpenter, actually. That's what he's doing around Hollywood. He's almost like the Brad Pitt character in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, in the sort of odd job sense of the word. He's kind of just doing all this stuff to sort of make ends meet. So that's what brings him into the Star Wars orbit. Francis Ford Coppola, who, again, Lucas knew Harrison Ford, Coppola knew Harrison Ford. Coppola had actually been hiring Harrison Ford to expand his home studio because he had just had this huge success with The Godfather, and he wanted to do more work from his house, be able to do more of his directing and editing and film production stuff. So he's expanding this film production director studio in his house. And that's what Ford's doing, is he's building all these cabinets, all this furniture, for the control boards and all that stuff. That's what he's doing in Francis Ford Coppola's house when Francis Ford Coppola and Lucas are screen testing actors with line readings for Star Wars casting. Lucas originally grabs him because he knows him, says, "Hey, we'll pay you to do some screen testing. Will you help read these lines to these people?" That's actually what ends up getting Harrison Ford the job, because he would read all the lines better than any of the people that came in and tried to audition for the movie. So this is really what sort of resuscitates Ford's career in Hollywood. With a less successful Star Wars, I think Ford's still going to continue acting, because this is enough to sort of make him still, a bigger presence in Hollywood. This is going to be his biggest movie that he's ever been in. It's a major role. He is very, impressive in the original Star Wars. It is just a perfect character for him. He probably doesn't have some of the same big breakout roles from the 1980s. Indiana Jones is really kind of a fascinating one to talk about, because originally Steven Spielberg and George Lucas did not want Harrison Ford for that, because they were trying to do what they had done with Star Wars and get a less prominent actor, someone who wasn't well known, who was going to be the face of this franchise. Just to give you guys some ideas of who might have become Indiana Jones if Harrison Ford didn't. I was really kind of surprised by some of these names when I was doing some research. Bill Murray, that would have been kind of interesting. I think he would have done a fair job at it, but it would have been, kind of played at much more of the sort of comedic side, I think, of Indiana Jones, which they're pretty funny movies. Nick Nolte would have been kind of an interesting choice. Chevy Chase, fresh off the end of his Saturday Night Live stint. I think that one would have been kind of interesting, because Chevy Chase and Harrison Ford, they have kind of the same look to them as actors. You can kind of picture Chevy Chase, superimposed over, the Harrison Ford posters of Indiana Jones. So that one would have been kind of interesting. I wonder if they would have had more than one indie movie if they had hired Chase, because he's notoriously difficult to work with. Jack Nicholson is another interesting one, because this is sort of when he's up and coming. This is, the Indiana Jones films are right around the time when he's kind of doing Chinatown. He's done One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He's kind of an up and comer. Let's see who else. Jeff Bridges, that's kind of an interesting one. I actually kind of, me being a personal fan of Jeff Bridges, I think that's my personal favorite, but I don't know how likely it is. Sam Elliott, Mr. Cowboy Mustache Man himself. David Hasselhoff, kind of an interesting one. And Tom Selleck. Tom Selleck is the one that actually is really kind of the most plausible. So a little bit of a detour here. The casting directors for Indiana Jones liked Jeff Bridges for the role, actually. George Lucas's wife, who was one of his main producing partners and directing partners, she really liked Tom Selleck. Selleck was actually initially hired for Indiana Jones, but he was under contract with CBS because he just filmed the Magnum PI pilot. So he was basically, on the hook if CBS decided to greenlight Magnum PI for a full show. They'd only done the pilot at that point. Ironically enough, the production of Indiana Jones asking about Selleck's availability is one of the things that got CBS to greenlight Magnum PI. They realized that, oh, this guy's actually in demand. Maybe we've got something with this show. We should, lock him up and make sure we've got him. So they committed to Magnum PI for the first season. That then means Tom Selleck is out of the running for Indiana Jones. He has to drop out with like 2 weeks or 3 weeks before filming. So they're scrambling to find another actor. Well, ironically enough, Magnum PI gets hit by the 1980 writer's strike. So Tom Selleck is basically doing nothing, twiddling his thumbs for 3 months while the strike is going on. Well, that means he could have actually filmed the first Indiana Jones movie and then been done in time to go do the first season of Magnum PI. So that's kind of a really interesting one. I think Tom Selleck would have been a pretty interesting Indiana Jones. I think he would have brought a lot of that same magnetism to Indiana Jones. But anyway, that's our little detour on Indiana Jones. What if Tom Selleck was Indiana Jones instead of Harrison Ford? I do think, getting back to Harrison Ford, I think without the success of, some of the later Star Wars movies really cementing him as a Hollywood megastar, and, without Indiana Jones, he's probably not going to get some of his really famous later roles in the 80s and 90s that sort of make him a Hollywood leaning man. Like, Blade Runner, he may still get that one because it's in the science fiction sort of, genre pigeonhole. Witness, Working Girl, the post Red October Tom Clancy movies, Patriot Games, Clear and Present Danger. We've also got some interesting side conversations we can get into about, what happened with Alec Baldwin after Red October and what would have happened if he had become the Jack Ryan character more. But basically, Harrison Ford is probably kind of, I hate to use the phrase just another, but he's just another Hollywood, actor, kind of leading man, kind of side character, doesn't have a lot of huge roles to his name, does some movies, but they're not, these big, famous critical darlings and stuff. So I think Harrison Ford really probably has a much different career without Star Wars being what it is in our timeline. I also want to kind of go onto the technical side of things, because one of the things that Star Wars, the production, did is it really jump-started the exploration of non-practical effects in movie production. At this time, they don't really have computers. They're playing with them a little bit to do special effects, but everything's still models, hand puppets, things like that, like physical props. Obviously in episode 5 and 6 and Empire and Return of the Jedi, Yoda, is a physical prop. He's essentially a puppet that's played by Frank Oz. But at the time, Lucas is one of the first guys who's really kind of exploring the idea of using computers to depict, especially some of the space flight and the space battle scenes, because those are very, complicated to try and get filmed with props and keep people written out of the edited out of the scenes who are managing the little figurines and all the explosions and stuff. So he actually originally at one point had gotten a test rendering done of these X-Wing starships flying in kind of a formation on sort of an attack run, just like the Death Star run from the original movie. And just kind of as a proof of concept, he didn't end up using a whole lot of computer animation for the films, at least at first, because it was still prohibitively expensive. But he had proof of concept. He ended up actually renting a warehouse in an industrial area of, I want to say Santa Barbara, but I could be wrong, somewhere in kind of the LA area, basically. And he sets up a production effects company called Industrial Light and Magic, ILM. He also creates a sound company called THX, which has very, very famous, audio logo. The movie, theaters always play sort of the audio company logos at the beginning and the production companies. THX is this big booming wall of sound that they play. Very famous introduction. A lot of you have probably heard of. But without Star Wars becoming the huge hit that it does, do ILM and THX become these huge juggernauts of the sort of post-production movie world that have all these huge hits in the 1980s and 90s? These are the guys who were behind a lot of the effects in Jurassic Park. Is Jurassic Park even a movie in the same way because they can't CG render all of these dinosaurs that they have? They did still use some physical props, but the T-Rex, a lot of it is, other than the close-up shots, these big Titanic shots, they're all computer generated. Does that still happen in this universe where Lucas does not have essentially the carte blanche and more money than God after the success of Star Wars to go and start all these companies and experiment with all this stuff? ILM in particular, I think, is really kind of an interesting one that really, kind of ripples on ripples on ripples on, it's a butterfly effect, because with a different ILM, we probably would not have the same Disney Pixar computer animated studio that we have today. John Lasseter is a guy who was originally hired by Lucasfilm, which is another one of these sort of conglomerate of companies that does all this production work. He was hired by Lucasfilm to head the computer graphics division. He had actually gotten fired by Disney for trying to constantly promote computer animation. This is when Disney was, kind of finishing up their golden age run, and they're hitting a rough spot where they don't have a lot of huge successful animated movies. They kind of come back in the late 80s. But, this is a time when Disney is still doing hand animation, and they're, at this point, not doing a very good job at it. Lasseter is trying to push for the advancement of computer animation, and it does not go over very well. So he gets fired from Disney, gets hired by the CGC of Lucasfilm. CGC, the computer graphics group, then gets sold to CGG, sorry. They then get sold to Pixar and get wrapped up in that. Lasseter then oversees all of the Pixar projects through basically the mid 2000s. I mean, he is the guy. He personally directed Toy Story 1, Toy Story 2, A Bug's Life, Cars, Cars 2. These are these huge hits, especially in the early days of Pixar being sort of a computer animated cartoon, studio, instead of Disney being still, a hand animated cartoon style with Pocahontas and Sleeping Beauty and Beauty and the Beast and, all of that. Does Lasseter do all of that? Does CGG even get sold off to Pixar? Do they have the technology? Do any of these movies even get made? And, interesting follow-up to that, Pixar was run by Steve Jobs at this point. Steve Jobs had famously been ousted from Apple for being kind of a problematic guy to deal with. The suits had kind of run in and taken over Apple, and famously they kind of run it into the ground until they have to bring Steve Jobs back in the mid-90s. But while Steve Jobs is wandering through the wilderness, Pixar is his main, gig, is what he's sort of, well known for really running. So without a hugely successful Pixar developing all, these fancy, technologies and everything else, does Steve Jobs end up going back to Apple? I find it kind of hard to believe that he wouldn't at some point, but it's interesting to wonder about what his sort of resume cachet would have looked like if he doesn't have this Pixar thing to hang, some of his hat on. So it's really just kind of interesting to think that without Star Wars being as successful as we have had in our timeline, how much of the modern film industry would have been different. Just to kind of bring it all back together, we would have had some of the actors probably do much of the same stuff. George Lucas would not be nearly as much of the household name. Harrison Ford is probably a completely different career path that he's got. But I think most interestingly for us is the sort of cultural backbone of modern Hollywood. All of these CGI special effects, all these big, bright, shiny, fancy computer graphics in movies, the sort of modern studio IP machine is completely different. If George Lucas had just used the original Alan Dean Foster space serial Flash Gordon-esque treatment for his Star Wars sequels. Now, this is, like I said, kind of this is a solo episode. I tend to get kind of more abstract. I like to leave things open-ended. I don't necessarily always want to have, definite sort of paths down every fork and everything that we might want to explore. I think it's kind of interesting to leave some things hanging in the wind, so to speak. It's entertaining to sort of imagine what these things might look like without having any real definite answers and just kind of leaving things to wonder. So that is where we're going to leave this episode. I thank you all for joining me on this little solo adventure in the Wayback Machine. Everybody else is asleep, so I figured I'd kind of break in and take it out for a joyride. If you have enjoyed this episode, or if you have not, and you just want to tell me that I'm completely wrong about everything that I've said for the last 35 minutes, and that, Star Wars would have done something completely different and, all that, let me know. Leave a comment in the Discord. If you have any other topic suggestions, any pop culture stuff that you want to do, any historical weird twists of fate that you want us to explore, we have a topic suggestions area in the Discord. Or if you want to see about having us revisit some of our older episodes, we've been doing this for a few years now. And some of our earlier episodes, if any really show some interest, we could probably revisit just to see if we think that the same, forks and twists of fate that we predicted back then, if we think would maybe turn out differently today. So if you have any suggestions, like I said, hit us up in the Discord. Let us know what you think. Everybody from the team is keeping an eye out from it. But I think that's a good place to wrap this up. So as we always say here on A Fork in Time, if you come across a fork in time, what should you do? Take it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.